Hi there. My name is Dr. Adam Rosenfeld. I'm the instructor for Philosophy 252. That's History of Modern Philosophy. And this video is for the web section of this course. The way that videos will typically work in this course is that I'm going to be recording the lectures that I have with the face-to-face version of this course that's running concurrently with the online section. So I'll be recording the lectures. You'll hopefully get some sense of the discussion and the back and forth that's going on in those lectures. I'll do my best to try to microphone the rest of the class in addition to myself. And in fact, we just had a meeting with the face-to-face class, and so I'll be posting in just a moment. I'll be posting about 45 minutes, the last 45 minutes of that meeting. The first part of that meeting, I introduced myself to them and I went over the syllabus. Since the online section has a slightly different syllabus than the face-to-face section, I need to do this a little bit separately. So this is our introductory video. Hi, I'm Adam, and you are whoever you guys are. Feel free to shoot me an email to let me know who you are and if you have any special concerns or questions about the class. If you'd like to know some stuff about me, the real basics are that I grew up in Southwest Houston. I did my undergraduate studies at the University of Texas at Austin. While I was there, I studied chemistry and I also studied philosophy. After that, I worked as a chemist for a little while, and then I taught high school chemistry and physics for a little while, and then I went back to graduate school at Stony Brook University, where I got my PhD in philosophy. I'm really excited about teaching this class. I'm really excited about teaching history of philosophy classes in general here at UNCG. Some of you may recognize me from the ancient philosophy class. I also teach the ancient philosophy class. In fact, we just finished up a section of the ancient philosophy class last semester. If you haven't taken the ancient philosophy class, that's okay. You're missing out. It's a good class. I think so, at least. But it's not a requirement in order to take this modern philosophy class. Let me run through the syllabus with you guys really quick. And hopefully that'll be all that I really need to do in this video. This course is, as I mentioned before, about modern philosophy. Modern philosophy doesn't necessarily mean contemporary philosophy. Modern doesn't mean now, what's going on now. Modern and modernity refer to a very specific period of time. Usually the history of Western Europe, at least, and the history of Western philosophy is broken up into three historical sections. One is the ancient and classical period, where you have a whole lot of Greek and Roman thinkers. So that's what gets covered in the ancient course. That goes from about 500 BCE to about 5 CE, or 500, 600 BC to about the 5th century AD. Then there's another period called the medieval period sometimes. In fact, there's quite a bit of dust up over just what to call it and the way that it's been portrayed. Sadly, we do not offer a class in medieval philosophy or some comparable version of that we would call it. It would be a very, very cool class, and if we, for a variety of reasons, we don't offer it. I wish we could. And then after the medieval period is the modern period. Then you get all kinds of fights about like when it starts and when it ends, but I think a lot of consensus has it starting sometime in the early to mid 1600s. And the ending is a lot more contentious, depending on what sorts of things we're talking about. It might end in the late 1700s, might end in like the mid 1800s. Depends on who you're talking to and what their focus is. We're going to be, and then everything after that modern period is what's known as contemporary. We're going to be following two threads of thought, very similar, parallel threads of thought through this modern period. One of them is going to be about epistemology and metaphysics. Epistemology is the study of how it is that we know what we know and what it means to say that you know something. What are the standards for fixing your belief, for believing that something is true? That's what epistemology is all about. It comes from the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge, depending on the translation. But a lot of folks will translate episteme as knowledge. And the ology, obviously, is the study, the logos, the orderliness of episteme. Metaphysics is a slightly weirder beast. If we had to sum it up really quickly, which is what I'm about to do, metaphysics is this question of what is the reality beyond appearances, and how would we know anything about the reality beyond appearances? What are the sorts of things that we can say are for sure about how the world actually is versus just it seeming that way to us? That's what metaphysics is all about. And the first half of the class is going to be concerned with a unit that's following a thread in that thought. That thread is going to start with René Descartes, and it's going to end with Immanuel Kant. And there's a very kind of clear and coherent conversation that's going on there. If we had to sum up what exactly is going on in modernity with respect to metaphysics and epistemology, I'd have to say that what we see from the end of the Renaissance, the beginning of like the Age of Enlightenment, up until the place where the Age of Enlightenment comes into its full fruition, and that seems to be like what a big part of what's characteristic about modernity is this shift from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. Then in epistemology and metaphysics, the big deal is we've got the rise and kind of establishment of modern science as we know it. So this is kind of a Newtonian natural science, this version of science that most people believe, or most people think that this is how science always works. And in a lot of respects, science totally does work this way. In the early 20th century, some weird sorts of things started happening in science that, and in the late 19th century, some weird questions about social science started popping up. Anybody who's taken a philosophy of science class will tell you that like this modern picture of what science is, that's not the end of the conversation. But it's what most people's ideas about how scientific knowledge is produced are all established through the epistemology and metaphysics that comes through in this modern era. The second half of the class is going to be following a slightly different thread, and that thread is a political and moral one. This is a thread that, if we had to sum it up, and I will, it's the emergence of liberal democracy, Western liberal democracy as we know it. Prior to that, it wasn't obvious that this was the best way to run a nation state, to kind of organize a group of people. The whole concept of exactly what the legitimacy of the authority of the state is something that people are wrestling with throughout modernity, throughout modern political theory, and this question of like under what conditions can the citizens of the state throw off the authority of that state. When is a revolution, when is a revolt against political authority justifiable? What sorts of rights do citizens have, and where do those rights come from? These are all conversations that are going on through the Age of Enlightenment during modernity, and we're going to trace that conversation starting with Thomas Hobbes, moving on to John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, looking through a bunch of variations on talking about like how it is that we come out of some hypothetical state of nature, and what sorts of social contracts, what sorts of like reasonable sorts of agreements people would come to if the alternative to coming together and forming a community with certain rules that everybody submits to, the alternative to that is to be off on your own in the wild. So that's the Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau trio. We'll also look at some other folks. We'll look at some American stuff. Definitely the Declaration of Independence. Definitely the South Carolina. What's it called? The South Carolina justifications for secession in the Civil War. What sparked the Civil War? We'll be reading that. If we can, I'll try to squeeze in some Federalist Papers stuff. We're going to be reading a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft, who asks a pretty pertinent question at the end of modernity, which is like, yeah, what about all the people that get left out of this social contract? What about all the people that seem to have been ignored in the way that this was set up? First and foremost, women. What about women? And then kind of where does the conversation go on from there? And we'll end it with another piece from Immanuel Kant called What is Enlightenment? A nice, short, pretty accessible piece as Kant pieces go. So those are the two halves of the class. First half, epistemology and metaphysics. Second half, politics and moral philosophy. Mostly politics, though. The way that a standard kind of like assignment cycle is going to work is I'll assign a reading. You guys will do the reading. I'd love it if we could just leave it at that. I assign the reading and then students do the reading. But I know that the reality of the way that everybody's overscheduled is that if I don't have some sort of mechanism to enforce doing the readings, then people have a tendency to kind of put it on the back burner and forget about it. And I understand that if you had no immediate consequences for not doing a reading, and that was the only thing that you could kind of put aside and not do right now, I could see how that would. It's a reasonable sort of choice to make for people who are overscheduled. Unfortunately, what this means is that I have to give you a reading quiz, and the reading quiz is pretty straightforward. It's just a couple of multiple choice questions, directing your attention to certain places in the reading, and making sure that you've actually done the reading. Every time there's one of those reading quizzes, you're going to get up to three chances to take that quiz, and we'll accept the score, the best score of all of the attempts that you make out of those three. So if you kind of stumble on a couple of things while you're taking those reading quizzes, that's okay. You'll get to take another shot at it. And this is going to help you, hopefully, figure out where it is that you're misunderstanding things so that you can fix some of your own misconceptions before we even get to the point where we're discussing the material with one another. Those reading quizzes are designed to flag when there are gross miscomprehensions going on. So if you're doing poorly on those reading quizzes, this means that something bad is happening and you and I need to talk and try to figure out how we're going to get you back on track. If you're doing well on those quizzes, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've completely mastered the material. A lot of this material is difficult enough that I would say that none of us are ever going to completely master it. But at the very least, I'll say something like this. To do poorly on the quiz means that something's wrong. To do well on the quiz means that at least you don't have these kind of gross miscomprehensions, these kind of gross errors in thought. You might still need a little bit of work. It's just kind of it's a first pass at trying to catch folks who are having trouble with the material. We'll get every couple of readings, or after once we've done a couple of cycles of assigned reading and reading quiz, and I'll be doing lectures with the face-to-face class and posting those lectures online for you guys to watch as well. After we get a couple of those going, we'll be ready to take on a kind of a meatier sort of a question. So we could have online discussion boards, so that these will be part of the assignments. I'll give a prompt after we've read through a couple of things, and I'll ask a question through this prompt that gets you to try to take the next step beyond just telling me what it is that the authors are saying, to actually engage the questions or to put them in conversation with one another. When I make those prompts, we'll have a system of doing the discussion boards that involves one of three groups making a first round of posts, in which they kind of lay out their response to the post, and then we'll have another second round of everybody else coming through and commenting on their posts. So that's the discussion boards. There will be more details that come along with the first discussion board post, which won't be for another week or so. We have a little bit of work to do before we have enough material to have a discussion about. Following those discussion boards, everybody will eventually have to write up their own response to that prompt as part of what's known as a reflection response draft. There are going to be somewhere around 6 or 7 of these reflection response drafts, so that means also around 6 or 7 different discussion boards throughout the semester. Half of them are going to be in the first half of the class, half of them are going to be in the second half of the class. And those are only going to be graded on the basis of completion. I realize that you're putting some labor into it and you'd like to get some credit for it. You will get credit for doing it. It's an unmanageable amount of grading for me to do, to grade every single one of those assignments. That doesn't mean that it's not good for you to write it. It just means that I'm not going to get a whole lot of I'm not going to give it a whole lot of attention. What we will do though is halfway through the semester, when we get to the end of the first unit, I'll ask you to look back on the reflection response drafts that you've done and pick the one that you think is the most interesting. Pick the one that you think you can punch up into a more polished short paper. That I will read and comment on and get back to you, hopefully with enough feedback to be worth your while. So there will be one of these final reflection responses at the beginning, at the end of the first unit, and then another second one at the end of the second unit. So we'll have reflection response drafts, 3 or 4 of them in the first half. Eventually, when we get to the end of that first unit, you'll pick which one of those you want to punch up into a paper, and you'll submit that. I'll grade it, and then we'll move on to the second unit, where we'll do the same thing, right? 3 or 4 different discussion topics about political philosophy in the modern era. Everybody will write up their own draft. They'll be graded on the basis of completion, and then at the end, you'll pick the one that you like the most, punch it up, polish it, submit that, and it'll be graded seriously. There will also be 2 exams. One exam for the first half of the course on metaphysics and epistemology, one exam in the second half of the course on politics. That's pretty much the way that the structure of the course. You'll notice that the syllabus is posted online on Canvas under Syllabus. Also right under that is a tentative week-by-week schedule of the topics that we'll be addressing. That's just to give you some idea of our pacing, maybe a little idea about like if you anticipate some scheduling problems, you might be able to read ahead a little bit. Assignments will be posted as they approach, though. I'm not kind of laying out the entirety of the course on Canvas now so that everybody can go through and complete it at their own pace. This class is designed to be unfolding concurrently with the face-to-face class in real time. I encourage you to look through more of the syllabus. I'm only going over those few very basic things. There's plenty of material in the syllabus that's worth looking at, including some general course policies, including some tips for reading and writing, both of which I would say are very, very useful sorts of tips, and hopefully the sort of thing that you will take advantage of. The number one complaint that I get from folks who have trouble with this class is that the reading is difficult and that there's a lot of it, and that's true. The reading is difficult and there's a lot of it. You need to be very careful and intentional about the way that you read these texts. They're weird, they're different. For folks who haven't taken a philosophy class before, folks who haven't taken even a history of philosophy class before, maybe you've taken other philosophy classes, it wasn't a history course, you weren't reading primary source texts from hundreds and hundreds of years ago that have been gone through like multiple layers of translation sometimes, then you'll recognize that this is some difficult stuff. We'll be reading some stuff by Immanuel Kant about halfway through the semester, his Prolegomena to Any Future Metaphysics. And I'll say without a whole lot of exaggeration, there's a really good chance that that piece is going to be the hardest thing that most of you will read as undergraduates.